And then we had a hearing on Monday, and we went to court and we explained to the judge what was going on and how this was all working. And fortunately, the judge was fair and he was kind and he was sympathetic. And he said, you know what? No, you can't stop their sale. Keep it going.
For years, the question that Diesel Brothers fans kept returning to was the one that nobody from inside the story would fully answer. Two men who had built everything together, who had turned a small repair shop in Woods Cross, Utah, into a national television brand watched by millions, who had been so publicly inseparable that their professional identities became genuinely difficult to distinguish from each other, and then, in a compressed and brutal stretch of time between 2023 and 2026, it all came apart in ways that were simultaneously very public and almost completely unexplained. The arrest, the lawsuits, the divorce, the silence from Diesel Dave that went from days to weeks to something that started feeling permanent. Fans who had followed every build and every episode were left piecing together a collapse from court filings, social media posts, and a conspicuous absence of any joint statement explaining what had actually happened. Now, with enough distance from the worst of it to speak with something approaching clarity, Heavy D has finally started filling in the spaces that the silence left behind. And the story that emerges is more complicated, more human, and ultimately more honest than the version most people had assembled from the outside. Dave Sparks and Dave Kiley did not meet through the truck world, which is a detail that tends to surprise people who assume their connection was always primarily professional. They met at a church singles event in Utah, two ordinary young men looking for nothing more specific than conversation and maybe some new people to spend time with. What they discovered in each other was an obsession so specific and so complete that it functioned almost like a language only they fully spoke. Dave Sparks had already walked away from Weber State after a single semester, finding classroom environments incompatible with the kind of kinetic, hands-on engagement that mechanical work provided him. Dave Kiley was not someone who merely liked trucks. He structured his life around them in a way that most people reserve for things considerably more socially acceptable to be that focused on. When these two found each other that night, the conversation that started did not end for years. It became a business partnership, a television career, a friendship of the specific and rare variety, where shared obsession compounds rather than fades, and eventually a brand that neither of them had fully imagined when they were still just two guys with grease on their hands working late into the Utah nights. The repair shop they opened together in Woods Cross was not a calculated business launch. It was an extension of who they already were, a physical space where the ideas that had been developing between them in conversation could be tested immediately rather than planned indefinitely. The YouTube channel came out of the same impulse. They were building and modifying diesel trucks in ways that pushed the machines to their absolute limits, and filming it was simply the most natural way to share what they were doing with anyone who might be interested. The audience that found those early videos was not something either of them had manufactured. It grew because the content was genuinely unusual. Two people who knew what they were doing at a level that communicated itself on camera in ways that performance alone cannot replicate. When the Discovery Channel came looking, the transition to television felt like a logical extension of something that already existed rather than a reinvention of it. Diesel Brothers debuted in January 2016, ran for 7 seasons. And during that time, the two Daves became household names in a corner of American culture that had not previously had its own nationally televised identity. What Heavy D has been more willing to discuss in the period since everything collapsed is the way success changed the nature of what they had built without either of them necessarily being aware of how significant that change was becoming. The show created pressure that the garage had never produced. Not pressure between them personally, at least not initially, but the structural pressure that comes from operating inside a media brand rather than a workshop. Decisions that had once been made between two people over coffee became decisions that involved networks, producers, legal teams, and merchandise partners. The spontaneity that had made their content compelling in the YouTube era was increasingly managed and scheduled in the television era. Heavy D has acknowledged that the transition created friction not primarily with Diesel Dave, but with the institutional machinery that had grown up around both of them. The show that made them famous also created a version of them that was, in important ways, no longer entirely theirs. The legal situation that began in 2017 with a lawsuit from Utah physicians for a healthy environment introduced a dimension of external pressure that neither of them had any framework for handling. The lawsuit alleged that builds featured on the Diesel Brothers show involved disabling emission systems on diesel trucks, a practice associated with production of heavy black exhaust that the physicians argued was a genuine public health concern rather than entertainment. The show's own footage became part of the evidence against them. Every plume of exhaust that had looked spectacular on television was being recontextualized in court filings as documentation of regulatory violations. By 2018, a federal injunction had placed restrictions on certain types of modifications. By 2020, financial penalties had reached the hundreds of thousands of dollars, with payments going to federal government and to Davis County. Legal fees from a Utah physician's case pushed the total closer to $1 million. A federal appeals court used the phrase flagrant misconduct in describing the conduct in question, language that does not appear in routine regulatory disagreements, and that registered publicly as an indication of how seriously the courts were treating the situation. What Heavy D has been clearest about in his recent account of events is that the legal pressure did not simply create financial strain. It created a fundamental tension between the identity that had made them successful and the reality that the law was now defining around that identity. The Diesel Brothers brand had been built on pushing machines to extremes, on doing things with trucks that most people considered impossible or inadvisable, and on broadcasting those extremes to an audience that found them thrilling precisely because of how far they went. The Clean Air Act enforcement said, in effect, that some of those extremes were not just inadvisable but illegal. Navigating that tension, while simultaneously maintaining a television brand that depended on the continued appeal of that exact identity, was not something that had any clean solution. The two men were being pulled in directions that were genuinely incompatible, and the public persona they shared made it impossible to resolve the tension privately. The trademark case that followed added another layer of exposure that operated entirely separately from the emissions dispute. Diesel SBA, an Italian fashion company with decades of brand history behind the word diesel, filed a trademark infringement case against the Diesel Brothers merchandise line, specifically the Diesel Power Gear brand that had grown into a significant revenue stream alongside the television show. The case escalated into a full federal trademark trial, and by 2023 the court had found the business entities liable for trademark infringement and ordered damages of $11,800,000. When you add that figure to the payments and legal fees from the emissions case, the total legal exposure that had accumulated around the brand that Heavy D and Diesel Dave had built together approached $13 million. That number did not represent a setback that could be absorbed and worked around. It represented a structural threat to everything they had built, and it arrived at a moment when the partnership was already navigating considerable internal stress. Heavy D has been careful in how he describes what happened between him and Diesel Dave in this period, and that carefulness is itself telling. He does not describe a dramatic confrontation or a single moment of betrayal. What he describes is something more gradual and in some ways more difficult to process, a divergence in how each of them understood what the brand was and where it needed to go in the face of everything that was happening legally and financially. The decision to leave Discovery Channel in 2023 was a mutual one, not a forced separation, and Heavy D has been consistent about that point. Both men agreed to walk away from the television format and pursue independent directions, with the understanding that the show had run its course and that the future needed to look different from what the past had been. What neither of them fully anticipated was how completely the subsequent collapse of the legal situation would accelerate the distance between them. The arrest on October 7th, 2025, when U.S. Marshals took Dave Sparks into custody in Salt Lake City for contempt of court related to unpaid financial penalties totaling over $843,000, was a moment that converted the gradual divergence into something that felt final. Heavy D has described that period with a directness that was not previously characteristic of how he discussed the legal situation publicly. He acknowledges that the decisions that led to the contempt charge were his to own, that the pattern of non-compliance with court orders reflected a stubbornness that he can now see clearly and that he could not see clearly enough in the moment. The arrest was not something that happened to him. It was a consequence of a series of choices he made, and he is not interested in constructing a version of events in which those choices were someone else's responsibility. What the arrest did to the relationship with Diesel Dave was not create a rupture so much as it made the existing distance unmistakable. After October 2025, Diesel Dave went quiet in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet that had characterized the period since their mutual exit from Discovery Channel. No joint appearances. No public statements addressing what had happened. No visible effort to maintain the shared public identity that had once been so central to both of their professional existences. Heavy D has acknowledged that this silence was painful in ways that were separate from everything else he was managing at the time. He and Diesel Dave had built something together that represented years of shared work, shared risk, and a shared vision of what was possible when two people with the same obsession found each other. The silence after the arrest felt like a response to the cumulative weight of everything that had preceded it. Not just a legal crisis, but the years of mounting pressure that had been changing the nature of what they were to each other long before the marshals arrived. The divorce filing from Ashley Sparks in March 2026, 5 months after the arrest, was a third collapse in a sequence that had been building across years of legal and financial pressure. Heavy D has not spoken extensively about the marriage in this period, which is consistent with the privacy about his personal life that has always been present even when his professional life was entirely public. What he has acknowledged is that the compression of events in that 5-month window, the arrest, the ongoing legal pressure, and then the marriage ending, represented a kind of simultaneous structural failure across every area of his life that required him to completely reassess what he was doing and why. What he has been more willing to discuss is the direction that came out of that reassessment. The work on EMBBR Motors, the clean energy venture he had been developing since acquiring rights connected to canceled Nikola Badger project in February 2024, represents something that Heavy D describes not as a contradiction of his diesel identity, but as an evolution of the same underlying interest that always drove the work. He has always been fascinated by what engines can do at their extreme limits. Clean energy technology operates at a different kind of extreme, one that requires the same engineering intensity and the same willingness to push against what the conventional wisdom says is possible. The man who became famous for diesel smoke is now genuinely invested in hydrogen and electric systems, and he does not experience that as a betrayal of who he was. He experiences it as a continuation of the same questions asked in a different direction. Diesel Dave, in the meantime, continues driving the Brodozer and Monster Jam events, still powered by a Cat C13 engine, still connected to the diesel performance culture that defined both of their rises. The two men who started in the same garage are now living inside genuinely different versions of the future they each imagined for themselves. Heavy D's account of what really happened between them resists the narrative of betrayal or dramatic rupture because, he says, that narrative is simply not accurate. What happened was more complicated and more human than that. Two people built something extraordinary together. The pressures that came with that success created divergences neither of them anticipated, and a series of legal and personal crises accelerated those divergences until the distance between them became something that ordinary friendship and professional partnership could no longer bridge in the way it once had. That is not a story with a villain. It is a story about what happens when the machinery of success and the machinery of consequence collide with each other at the same time. In the lives of two people who were never equipped by anything in their backgrounds to manage a collision of that size. Heavy D is still building. The direction has changed. The obsession has not. And what he has finally revealed about what happened between him and Diesel Dave is not a scandal or a confession. It is an honest account of how something extraordinary can become genuinely impossible to sustain, and how two people can walk away from the same wreckage in completely different directions without either of them being entirely wrong about where they are going.